All right, guys, welcome back to the Untitled Fitness Podcast. Today on the show, I have Steve DeNovi back again to talk about a few programming topics that I think that he has a lot of expertise in. He kind of mentioned this on his story regarding training maxes and how he made an article quite a while ago, and he's had lots of questions about it. So I figured it would be like a good opportunity to first go over that, and in general, like what a training max is, how to set them, how to use them, etc.
Yeah, so I get that question literally probably almost every day, if not every other day, because of my free program. And Training Max is kind of an odd thing because I don't think it's as much talked about anymore, in large part because of RPE training and variable percentages and kind of moving away from having a set training max. But the general population, like new lifters getting into powerlifting, people still running 5-3-1 and those kind of programs, like that's all they think about. Like it's almost like a crazy thing that they go like they hound so much on what should be my training max. And so for my free program, honestly, in the grand scheme of things, the training max isn't like some like big staple, but I get that all the time because I think that's just something that a lot of like new power lifters or even people who just don't have as much general knowledge of more modern programming methods really kind of hold on to. And it's still important though, because I'm sure you do as well. There's still percentage-based work that we both sprinkle in, or we're using some type of percentages to help kind of guide within ranges or whatever it may be. So they're still important, but they're kind of an odd thing. And I wrote that, like I said, I wrote that article a while ago. I honestly haven't read it in probably 5 years or whatever I wrote it. So I don't even remember what I said in that. I think it's pretty true. But I plan to do a video on powerlifting now to cover like everything I would want to on training maxes so that like in the future, there's just a staple for it. But I think the general way of how to set them is, and kind of maybe the myth is, probably the myth is a training max is what you did in the meet. That's where a
Right.
lot of people go wrong. And that's where I think it's pretty well agreed upon with people and with enough knowledge that you don't do that, because what you do in the meet is literally hopefully the best you're going to be. But that's not what you're going to be on any given day, especially dependent on the lift. Like some people are going to peak a lot more on their conventional deadlift over what they can do in the gym versus bench. Maybe bench in a meet versus bench in the gym is pretty similar. And so you have to take into all those things into relevant account, and everything's going to be different per lifter. And so short and simple, if I was to give a little like 30-second or less clip, how to set a training max, it is the number that you believe that on any given day in the gym you could likely hit. Now, with that being said, that's hard for some people to be able to dictate. So there's obviously training max numbers you can use or calculators you can use to do E1 or M, but those are a bit dangerous because once you're starting to get further away from singles, it becomes a bit more muddied. I mean, I'm sure you've had people, or even I think even yourself, you're really good at
Yeah, me.
high rep deadlifts, aren't you? Yeah. Like
High up
my lifter,
everything.
yeah. I use my lifter Lorenzo, like he's deadlifted 750, but if you use his estimated 1RM from rep sets on deadlift, it would be like 850. But that's also why training maxes don't entirely work, because I could choose a training max for someone that is very solid. Like this is the number that they could probably hit any given day on the gym. But that's only for one rep. You might need a training max for a 3-rep set. You might need a training max for a 5-rep set versus a 7-rep set. Like there's a lot of disparity lifter to lifter, even lift to lift. You might have a lifter who's really well leveraged for deadlift that is comparatively really good at reps, but really bad at bench because of the longer range of motion, whatever it may be. And how you go about their training maxes have to be very, very different. So it's kind of hard to give some staple of like, here's how to set training maxes, which is why I want to do a full video on it. But I think kind of probably one of the things you wanted to get to as well is kind of just how to use them.
Right.
And I'm speaking for you, but I think we both probably use training maxes probably in two specific ways. One, with likely maybe back off work or like lower priority days where we know the RPE is going to be lower. And so using a training max where we know there's going to be variability on strength is going to be a pretty safe method, because even though it's a set number, like we know it's going to be easy enough that on any given day, it's still going to be well within the range of like exertion we're looking for. Or two, it's just kind of a starter point of how to be able to gauge what you think a lifter should be able to do to give them ranges or set goals towards the end of the block that within a range or variable percentage or RPE can still be give some context within that. Like, it doesn't have to be some set number that, oh, because you're 200 kilo training max, you are going to do 180 for a set of 3. You're going to say, oh, maybe 175 to 185 and things like that. That's probably more of kind of what we bias to now, because I think we've come to an agreement that just some set training max, for so many reasons, like I said, because of the variability in strength, the differences between lifts and their strongest versus your worst days. And then probably even more so is the variability between rep ranges, where a training max just doesn't fully suffice to be like the overall guiding tool for training.
Right. Like I agree with that. Like how I always conceptualize it is, you use it is like on like week one, especially if you're coming off of like, a wave loading structure, or like what's like your worst day, like under lots of fatigue, and then kind of just going off of that. And I'm even okay with like going a little bit lighter than like what they may be able to hit, like on average, just because I think that you and I can both agree, as far as like progression goes, all I really care about is setting them up for that next week and making sure that they are within a threshold where they can hopefully be strong enough to hit a little bit more weight in the long run. And I think that once you kind of know how much fatigue response somebody has, you can get better at incorporating those ranges and making training a little bit more predictable. And I think that especially with people that, you get them ranges, training masters can be really helpful with like how I would use it is, so like, say like for myself, like I know on a week one, any day, like I can comfortably hit with probably like 683 on deadlift, but my best is 722. And so I just kind of just gauge off of that. And I know that I gain about 2% strength week 1 through 3. And I can kind of create a range based off of that. But I usually will keep it like the high end of the range is like where I don't want them to go above, because lots of times lifters have that psychology. Like if I go on the low end of the range, it's a bad thing for some reason. But I get that, because powerlifters want to lift heavy, whereas in that week 4, we'll use like a little bit like a bigger range, and maybe I'll use that training max as like baseline. Like things went really bad, they had like a really bad overall like um recovery variables. But in general, like I think like what I'm getting at there is I use it like at the beginning of blocks, where I'm setting ranges on top sets more. And then I will gauge like how they're responding later on in the block. But I do use it a lot more on the down sets, because I think that, that's where we're going to have the more of that fatigue in there. I believe our Marcellus, that's how he programs too. He just uses like percentages based on like a training max for his down
Yep,
sets.
he'll just use percentages off of training max for almost a lot of his back off sets, and that's probably the majority of the spots. If I'm looking at where am I actually using a training max, it's a lot of times like on a tertiary bench day. But the number one place is back off sets on specific days that I want to control the average intensity, and that can be squat, bench, or deadlift, whatever it may be. And within that too, and that's also the benefit of having a training max for the back off sets like that, is you're able to control the average intensity while they can have more variability with their peak intensity. And that usually it keeps people from kind of like tipping over in fatigue, or just having way too hard of a session where like, oh, I feel super good, so I'm going to go really heavy on my top set, which they should. It's within the parameters of the program. But then that affects all of the back off sets being heavier. And then the totality of the workout takes a big jump in average intensity and creates a little bit more disproportionate fatigue. So I really like using set percentages for back off sets. And it also allows you to really make micro adjustments over time to be able to manage those training maxes, because just bumping up a training max by 2.5 kilos can make a difference in the sense of like the total tonnage and average intensity throughout the entirety of a macro cycle. If you're using back offset percentages for 3 days on 3 different bench days, and you bump it up by 2.5 to 5 kilos, that can be a difference. I mean, I've had numerous times where I bump it up by 5 kilos, and that is enough that it goes bad. Like it was too much. Like they apparently were just, even though that they've gotten significantly stronger, like that average intensity and like where we were at training max wise and back offset wise was exactly where they needed to be. But in a good way, a lot of times that's how we can kind of drive progress, is this very, very, very slow progression using that training max on the average intensity back offsets to kind of drive progression over time in a sustainable way. Because another thing, going back to how to use them or how to set them, is and a big issue people have is they hit a big PR and, oh, my new training max is 15 kilos above what I used to do. Boom, let's use that. If you do that, that drastically changes your program.
Yeah.
You are making a large jump in what is happening. And I have a video on like controlling rate of progression on YouTube where I think I kind of touch on this aspect of like
Right.
milk it for as long as you can. If you hit a 15 kilo PR, I'm probably only going to raise your training max by like 2 to 5 kilos. I might raise it more often, like every couple blocks I'll raise it versus maybe every 5, 6 months if you're not progressing in the same rate. But like milk that slow gains in average intensity and volume. I use the word average intensity. That's where you think of when you think of training maxes and percentages, but it's also volume because every single time you raise the training max, that now raises all the weights you're using by a certain number. And that then equates to total tonnage over a week, over a block that now is increasing. And so that's a way that you're actually increasing volume over time.
Right. That's something that Eric Bachman has pointed out to me like repeatedly with like secondary days. Like for example, like it's I think it's even more important to control the rate of progression on those with the training maxes because that's if you have too much of that increase in the average intensity, it will throw off how you're responding on that top end. And then I also think that we need to also remind ourselves that overload is like a range, not a fixed value. And we can do a wide variety of training loads and see progress. And I also think that especially if a big part of your programming is pushing accessories hard, and so you have that primary accessory that Marcellus likes to say, you can push that harder, and that intensity going up can kind of compensate for like keeping the back work a little bit more submaximal, and can also keep lifters a little bit healthier. And I really don't think that you need to make that frequent of changes, like you said, to like a training max, especially if your loads are going up in the gym, like 2.5 kilos can be a big enough difference to just keep that baseline going up over time.
Yeah. I mean, a good way to put it, I mean, this isn't a set in stone way to do it, but like you probably experienced this. Most people aren't seeing actual linear progress. They kind of get like a jump and then they plateau for a bit. They get a jump and then they plateau for a bit. It's not like every block they just had. We tend to see these jumps and then it stays for a bit. That's your time to very slowly let it increase. I mean, people don't like to think about 5 kilo PRs being a big PR, but if you're setting a 5 kilo PR every 6 months, that's awesome. That's going to add up. But that doesn't, you can also milk that of where every 3 months you're adding like 2.5 kilos to your training max and not actually following your true rate of progression with your 1RM and just kind of letting your training max slowly creep up to where it catches up. And then, oh, you got stronger. Now you let it slowly creep up again and it matches it. And then you got stronger. And you just kind of keep running that pace versus just immediately matching it all the time. I think that's where a lot of people go wrong with it.
Right. And in regards to like matching that pace and increasing it, if somebody is having then that really rapid rate of progressions, I do agree with you. Like it is like past that beginner stage, it absolutely is jumps. Like randomly, some people just randomly like, here's 10 kilos. And it's just like as easy. And like I made the mistake too of like, oh, like 10 kilos. And then I start pushing everything harder. And then I start noticing, well, then my fatigue starts to get unchecked. And then that becomes really, really hard to manage. So when you are increasing it, like, would you say that like on average in general, like rule of thumb is like 2.5 kilos every like 3 months, so like a macro cycle? Because like I'm assuming that for more advanced lifters, like you have a longer macro cycle length than beginners.
I don't know if I'd say 2.5 kilos because it's dependent, but I would say, I know Marcellus has said this kind of too, is that at minimum, I'm probably going to use the same training maxes for the entirety of a macro cycle before warranting changing them. And then I'm going to review based on the progress of the macro cycle. Do I want to change them? And how much do I want to change them from there? So
I think what you can do there is like probably ask the lifter about like their general like fatigue using that. It's like they're probably don't have like much fatigue at all. That's probably safer to increase that. But if you're like, no, I feel like I'm like this is perfect like workload, like I feel like I'm getting like a productive amount of fatigue, then maybe you don't change it.
yeah,
That'd be like a good smart.
I generally bias to the fact that I'd rather let peak intensity rise up before I let average intensity rise up. And what I mean by that is like let them keep pushing those top sets or whatever it may be. Once those kind of maybe plateau and we're in some way we're not getting the stimulus, that's when then I might start bumping the average intensity up to then hopefully drive the peak intensity back up to then let it come in. So I'm always kind of letting them drive that peak intensity until I'm seeing that that's not producing the adaptations or stimulus we need. And then I start looking at the average intensity, more so the back offsets and the training maxes of how can I slowly let that ramp up to provide an overloading stimulus.
Mm-hmm. Have you found that maybe like more like maybe like certain rep ranges are more sensitive to those changes in the training max? Like like you were talking about earlier, like high reps maybe have like more room for error versus like the low reps because of the absolute intensity? Or do you have not found anything like that?
Uh, it's probably more so that like if you have a lifter who's disproportionate enough between low reps and high reps that you legitimately have to have different training maxes. Like you can't use the same training maxes. As well as I would say there's probably a little bit more variability with higher reps of like what is your training max, like if you're comparatively good. Let's go back to Lorenzo, or like you're talking about yourself. If your E1RM on a set of 7 is 850 versus your actual 1RM is 750, 850, 1% is a bigger gap. Does that make sense? Versus at
Yeah.
750. And so if you are at 1% difference, it is 2.5 kilos at 850 is not the same as 2.5 kilos at 750. It's disproportionately a smaller jump. So therefore you have more variability to play with within a training max at higher reps. Does that thought process make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So yeah, the higher your training max is comparatively at certain rep ranges, the more variability within that you have, because a 2.5 kilos is not equal between the two.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. You have to look at exactly like the whole like percentage. It's kind of like when you're looking at like bigger jumps on stronger lifters, like if you're deadlifting 800 pounds, like a 5% jump is going to be, 40 pounds. That might seem extreme to somebody that only
or even
300.
lift to lift. I mean, bench versus deadlift, like 2.5 kilos on a person who benches 125 but deadlifts 250. 2.5 kilos is not equal. They are very different. That is a very different percentage. And so for bench, if you bench 125, you might not be jumping the training max by 2.5 kilos. You may actually be looking at micro adjustments of like 1 kilos or 1.5 kilos at a time. Because if you're looking at the actual percentage jump, 1 kilo at 125 is equivalent to jumping 2 kilos at 250.
Right. One thing I want to ask you about too, Steve, is Rondell Hunt has basically a series on YouTube where he talks about how he's been able to avoid plateaus and working backwards and all that stuff. And you and Martin Marcellus had a series on powerlifting now where you guys sort of discussed the whole variable percentage training concept. One of the concepts that Rondell talked about I thought was really interesting and that I've been thinking about more in my own training and with lifters training is having different blocks, like have different goals, and based off of the training momentum you have going into that block. So for example, he said that there's like a rebounding phase where the peak intensity is, it's low, you're well below what you did. Maybe you're coming in off of a layoff, you got sick, you got hurt, whatever, or you just competed, and you're intentionally kind of sandbagging your peak intensity to create more momentum later on. Yeah, building blocks where you're like just below like what your best is. So maybe you've done, my case, best deadlift is a 700 conventional in the gym. Maybe you do like 683 and you hope that moves better. And you have like a progressing block, like after maybe one of those build phases where you more so auto regulate the peak intensity more and kind of go for like a bigger PR. Is this something that you think is, I guess, like, is this like becoming a little bit more common practice with how you program for athletes, or are you kind of always shooting for those PRs, or do you have these blocks that maybe have like a different goal of, we're not trying to PR, but we're trying to get in like a spot where we are in like recover enough that we know our body's good enough to like go for that PR and then like the next block? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think there's two things that determine that. One is programming style, and I'll touch on what I mean by that in a second. But the first and foremost is the lifter, and what I mean by that is look at Rondell. Rondell lifts a lot of weight. So we're going back to like when he has a 3% difference in his strength variation because of being detrained, that's a lot more than someone who is a beginner and only lifting 150 kilos. Like that might only be 2.5 kilos for that person lifting 150 kilos, but for Rondell, that could be 10 kilos on his lift. That's variation. So like for someone like him, I get how that has to happen, because you have to understand like when he detrains and he loses, let's say 3%, that 3% is a much greater number than someone who's just comparatively weaker and newer. And so that's why I think you see someone like him talking about that, or you'd probably hear Marcellus maybe kind of touch on that with some of his bigger guys. I think that's probably where a lot of that falls in line to. But it still can be dependent on the lifter. Like I have specifically a couple lifter, or Christiane Hazard. She wouldn't fit into that category. She's a smaller, lighter weight female, albeit she's very, very strong, but she tends to just really detrain hard after a meet. So every single time after a meet, we always take a block to kind of build up. We always set everything pretty conservative and be happy with that. There could be periods of time in life too. Like I have one lifter, unfortunately, he's had to drop out of nationals because he's taking his pharmaceutical board exam, and that's just more important right now, and that's affecting his training. And so we're pulling back from like having the goals of being PRs and whatnot, and just being more about like getting quality work in, and like knowing if we're still within a specific strength range, we know that's still really good with the variables at play there. So and then the programming style, like let's use an example of doing like 3-2-1 top set progression over a macro cycle. In that setup, yes, you could use what Rondell's talking about, but you may be looking at like trying to hit small little PRs for each of those rep ranges as you progress it. But there's also a style, and this is what Rondell does, I know pretty often, where maybe you hit a triple 3 blocks in a row, but each block you're progressing the actual exertion you're pushing it to. And then it's not until the third block that you're actually trying to hit a PR, and then you are actually prioritizing in some way, and maybe even doing like an artificial peak to make sure that that block is at its peak intensity versus maybe the prior blocks. You're like, okay, I know there's fatigue masking it. We're not really trying to actually hit PRs. Even if you are strong, I'm okay with it being a little bit more submaximal. That's not like you can undershoot the RPE cap. Because we know that we're not trying to hit our PR triple or whatever it may be. Just the example on this block, we're trying to build over a 3 block macro cycle to hit our PR triple at that. And you probably are going to find that more with maybe more advanced lifters who are not going to hit PRs very often. I mean, Rondell's super, super strong. He's not going to hit PR sets every single block. And maybe and maybe the setup of trying to hit PRs every block for him would not only not be successful, but it would be mentally taxing of having this thought of failing, of not accomplishing the goal each block. And it is better to set it up over a 3 block cycle to go for a PR, because you know you're not going to do that every single block.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points. Another thing that I was thinking about is like you mentioned that earlier, the progress it tends to be non-linear. And maybe that is like maybe you are in the spot where you can add 10 kilos to your deadlift, like that block, like out of nowhere you feel good. But like in my opinion, like if you have that, like that's something that you should take instead of just trying to like artificially extend the progression. But also in regards to programming style, like I will do a similar thing sometimes with my lifters, where like we do like a couple blocks of like singles like very often, or maybe even like 3 going into like a meet where we're just trying to keep things, that progressive intensity is just increasing for the peak intensities. Okay, there we go. Okay. Yeah, like what I was saying is that sometimes like with like the whole programming style thing, having multiple blocks where you have the same rep range can help artificially extend that progression. I know that Eric Helms like said that that's what he does on singles. Like he likes to keep them in consistently. I think that if you are going to do something like that, like the top single approach, that is kind of how you have to do it consistently over a few blocks, because you can't, the progression is just slower. Whereas if you do more of that wave progression, like the 3-2-1, like Marcellus does, like I think that's more valuable. It's kind of like the same thing, but you're just getting like different like small mental wins across that.
You've got to have the right lifter that can buy into that as well, though, because Rondell is an experienced lifter who has certain goals that are not inflated by ego or inflated by Instagram. I'm not saying everyone's inflated by ego or inflated by Instagram, but what I mean by that is Rondell's okay with not PRing or seeing that every single block. If you've got a newer lifter, they kind of need some like intrinsic goal to hit towards the end of each block. And that's where I think that kind of this macro cycle layout that a lot of people use of just like rotating 3 or 4 rep schemes throughout a macro cycle works really well, because even if they aren't necessarily getting stronger each block, like we can still PR a set of 5, then PR a set of 4, then PR a set of 3, and then PR a set of 2, and always kind of leave a little room in the tank so that we can recycle through it again, and then it hit another 2.5 kilo PR, and then recycle. And we might be able to do that for years. You might have our lifter be able to go 2 or 3 years just taking these small little PRs each time you're recycling those. And the mental wins that creates is really, really important for a lot of lifters. Versus Rondell, I think was just he's mature enough at this point that he's okay that if he's only hitting PRs very occasionally, like he understands like what he's putting in to be able to do that. And so it also like it goes back to the psychology of training. You need to know the lifter if you can go through something like that, if they can handle something like that, or if they need more like small rewards going through each block to kind of hold their interest and hold that like positive motivation and almost momentum. Like momentum is almost more psychological than it is physical. They're almost entirely mental. Like that's really where a lot of momentum kind of comes from, is like a lifter just having this buy-in that they just know training's going well, and they're having all these like small little wins, and they go into the next block with a positive mindset and feeling like I can continue to do this, and so on and so forth. So
Yeah, in regards to that momentum thing, like I would agree with that to some extent, and like as far as it being mental, but like I also think like you just have to like also like make like the right choices, like because some blocks like you might not PR, and like you have to understand like that's fine. Doesn't like powerlifting is a very long game, and having one block where you don't PR and they're like, yeah, I don't feel as good as I was hoping for on whether I'm supposed to be strongest, and then instead of like forcing that and like going like an RPE 10 or failing that, like just like taking what you have, like I think that's really important for that, like that mental buy-in and motivation. It's like, okay, like at least I made like the right choice, because I know that for myself, like sometimes I have come into blocks and I've like my week threes have said I should be totally good to go for this weight next week, and I'm fixed on that. And it's like, even though my warm-ups don't feel as good as they did last week, I like still try to do it, and then like I get so mentally like defeated, like if it's RPE 5,000 or I fail it or whatever, because it's like I know that it's gonna be harder for my body to like recover from, and just get better. I also think like over time too, like you kind of understand like what your lifter is like, because like for me, like I find it very mentally stressful, like knowing like high intensity PR like every single block. And in my opinion, like I like capping most blocks around like an RPE 8, because I think that those higher intensities make more sense like if you are in that peak condition and you are in the spot for a bigger PR, as opposed to like those lower intensities are better for like those small ones like over time. An RPE 8 is still heavy, but it's not gonna have like the same fatigue costs. I do think it is easier to like create and maintain training momentum if you do periodize that top set intensity in some way. Because if you are setting those PRs over time, like the ERM is still going up, and I know that's not as reliable as like an RPE 10, but I don't think we need to touch an RPE 10 to like know we're getting stronger.
yeah, for sure. I mean, I feel like barring it just happens, like it's going to happen sometimes. I really try to stay away from RPE 10 just because, again, there's the aspect of it sets up unrealistic standards where I think that then causes people to have more bad decisions, because to be able to beat that, they're going to have to RPE 10 again. And the fact is, anytime you get those really high exertions, strength is not the only factor. There's a high execution factor too. Because if you're doing a set of 5, one single rep that you start getting kind of out of your pattern and off your center of mass can elevate that RPE by 1 or a half RPE to 1, and all of a sudden now you can't do the same weight. And so there's just a higher fail rate at that. I mean, that's why people miss third attempts at meets. They might even have the strength, but like there's a skill and an execution factor as well, where a set of if you're sticking more around like RPE 8, there's more wiggle room and variance to having execution errors and still being able to hit a set.
Yeah, because in your peaking series, like I like how I think that like, and you and I have had conversations with the DMs like very briefly about this, but like I do think you do need to go to that near max single, like in a peaking block in some way, shape, or form. Like probably not like right before the meet for most lifters, but like have like a block before, where you maybe go to that near max single, and then you build that confidence going into the meet. Because like I think for a lot of people, like number one, like the skill aspect of like a single, like from an RPE 9 to like a 9.5 is like meaningfully different. Like you said, if you have like something kind of off with your positioning, especially with that, you could just not hit the lift. I also think from like an expectations perspective, like lifters like knowing that they're going to like do well at a meet, or they're in a good spot to do well, and that it's kind of just like you hit some RPE 8 and you're relying off of like the E1 or M. I think that can create a little bit more like self-doubt, and that can also impact like how they might peak or how they might treat like that last block to some extent. And the mental response to training is huge. I think the most underrated video on your channel is the psychology of programming, because like I think that's arguably like the most important factor, because it all kind of comes back to that with everything we're doing with like intensity perspective, volume, and exercise selection.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's things you learn as a coach when they hit that final like RPE 10 single. Like there might be technical breakdowns that aren't present prior. But probably more than anything is just the confidence. Lifters like they just are going to feel more confident and in control on meet day when they know they've done it before. Especially if they're less experienced and whatnot, and you don't have any type of prior data that says, oh, I don't have to do that, and they actually do better not doing that. That can be a case, but that needs to have some data behind it. And you need to have a lifter who can have buy-in for that. But yeah, most people need to be able to hit something heavy. It's also just powerlifting. Like we're supposed to have, that's the whole point of it. We're supposed to lift heavy. Like you got
Heavy
to
is
let them
fun.
lift heavy once in a while. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's one of the things is like if you tell our powerlifter, like, we're not going to ever train heavy, like there's a big skill to like grinding through reps. And one of the things that I did really well on my first, when I was starting off training was like, I kind of just did the RP like 9 to 10 thing, but I had like a wave load of like 5-3-1 across all lifts across like 3 weeks. And I was able to come back and PR like every single time, like linearly for like months on end. And like, I got really good at grinding and I haven't lost that skill yet. And one of the things I have noticed is like with the whole submaximal approach, like you do absolutely build strength, but like, better like that, but you still need to touch those heavier weights. Like there's this really critical skill component to learning how to grind through those heavier weights. I think you can also teach this on like accessories too, with really teaching lifters like you want to go into it's hard, it's getting grindy, and then like being okay with that, because like I feel like you lose like it's like less of that psychology, like, oh fuck, it feels heavy. When you're like under the bar, you walk out on like a squat. If you're used to like, well, this is how my leg presses feel, or my machine chest presses feel hard, so it's less of like that foreign feeling. Um, because it's something that you have to like really learn how to develop. And you'll see that these advanced lifters, like they're very good at that, and more beginners, like they aren't, just because they haven't had the exposure, or they don't have like the confidence they can actually like push through that sticking point.
Yeah. There's an element too, I need to word this correctly, that every lifter needs to start failing lifts at some point. Every lifter kind of needs to get injured at some point. I'm not saying you're trying to it by any means, but if you power lift long enough, you're going to fail a lift. If you power lift long enough, you're going to get injured. And we all know that when that first happens, lifters think their life is over. And they need to actually go through those actions at some point to start learning that, like, in the grand scheme of things, failing a singular lift is not the end of the world. Like, it is one training day, it's one practice day. The quicker you can just get that out of your mind and have it be a sunk cost, the better. When they get injured, understanding that it's not the end of the world. It seems like the end of the world at first because you can't tie your shoe, but in 4 days you feel fine, and in a week you're lifting again. Like I said, I'm not saying go fail or go get injured, but I'm saying, like, if you never push towards 10 RPE, or you're never hitting these really heavy sets where lifters have the possible chance to fail, and you're trying to like basically make it so they never fail, when they do, it's not going to be great. Like they kind of need to eventually experience that and understand and how to mentally and psychologically work through that.
I think it also helps them just get better at being more objective with like their training and like what their actual like limits are. Because if you don't know what RPE 10 is, like you can't gauge like how much more kilos you have left in the tank. I've made lots of mistakes with that, and like now it's like if I am really honest, and I'm like my litmus test all the time is like, Adam, if this was a meet, what would you have on your third attempt? Like, what would you have? Is if I'm in that context, instead of like, what do I think I should be able to lift today? I get so much better. I'm so much better at gauging things. And that's because like I failed, and I've tried on like week ones to like go too heavy. And like I know like right about where my max is and how much it kind of like fluctuates because I've made those mistakes. Because if you can look at training data as just that data and ways to like make you better, that's really how you're going to overcome plateaus. And like for me, a really big factor that I've had this entire year, I've had autoimmune issue with like celiac disease, and we have a disease that malabsorbs protein. It's hard to make progress. But I've learned that like I feel like the most important week of training is like the deload week, like actually like lowering down that fatigue enough so you can make long-term progress. Mental Health has put out some studies like, oh, like deload weeks and pair gains. I'm like, that's just not how life works. Like I'll just like I feel like people don't understand, like, and I didn't really get this too until this year, because I thought I was like more advanced. I don't think I was advanced, so Steve is like maybe I am getting to be advanced, but I could get away with like not doing that. Like I could keep pretty heavy and keep making progress. And like right now, it's like I've realized, oh, if I don't like really respect like that RPE 5 like week one like single or whatever Eric puts on the sheet for me, like I'm just not going to drop down fatigue. I'm going to burn out too soon, and I'm not going to be able to actually hit those peak loads that are going to get me like the strongest over time. And like fatigue management becomes so much more of a bigger factor um, as you do continue training. From what I've seen, because when you're more beginner, it just doesn't matter as much. The fatigue cost isn't as high as you keep getting bigger and stronger and lifting these heavier loads. Like if you don't ever drop down that fatigue, like I've seen that literally be like the bottleneck for so many lifters. Like once they get past like that linear progress.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure I've saw that Minnow Hanselman thing, and it doesn't apply in the same way. I'm sure it was very low training age people not lifting super heavy. And of course, like, and they probably had them overly deload, because I think the term deload gets a bit bastardized. Like you think that should just be a really light week. Deload could just
Yeah.
be tapering a couple back off sets by a couple percentage and doing one. Like it could be a deload is any form of fatigue management that is tapering anything to dissipate slight level of fatigue. Like there are so many applications of how you might do that and to the extent of it. Yeah, I mean that's it, the issue with that study and a lot of those deload studies is it's so extreme on what is a deload versus understanding that any form of slight taper in intensity or volume is a deload. So or even
Right.
like I mean I like a wave load process. A lot of times on a wave load, you don't actually change anything in the program. It's just the actual weight on the bar. Like you're just like RPE 5 is your deload. Like you don't even have to taper volume or anything. Like just the intensity coming back down is a deload. I mean that's what it is. Even though it's in sense your week one of your block, and you think, oh, it's the start of a new block. You are in sense deloading in some manner. Anytime you're actually reducing intensity, going back into a new block.
Right. I think the only like people think of deload weeks as like you're just not doing any training, and like that's what my taper is like for deadlift. To be fully transparent with you, I don't do anything for a week, and it shows up really well. If I was to do that on like squat and bench, like I would just detrain and be really weak, and I would lose that fitness. Like I've seen data like if I don't take a bench, like even just like on a taper week, like a light single, like RPE like 5 to 6, like 2 days out, I'm not strong. Same with like squat. Like, I have to have like if I have more than 2 days of rest, I detrain a little bit. And I think that finding that frequency of exposure and maintaining that is super important too. For a lot of lifters going into meets, like I've said with my deadlift, like I think that's the one lifter you can get more away with it. But I think that maintaining that frequency of exposure is important because when you talk about like our bodies get used to these like recovery patterns, and really all we're doing when we're peaking is like we should have a good training system that we know works, and then we're just slowly modifying just to variables volume and intensity to get that peak exposure. But I think one of the biggest issues I've seen with some clients that have come to me is like why the peaks didn't go well with their old coaches, like they dropped off like a day, and I'm like, why did you do on the bench? Like that's why you were like weaker. It matters.
Yep. Yep, for sure.
So I think that going into the next topic would be determining block length, because I wanted to see if you think this is something that's a little bit more like just like a fixed thing or something that you can change, like depending on what you're seeing. So like, for example, maybe like a lifter just takes longer to ramp into those higher loads and you need more time to like recover and adapt. So maybe have a longer block length versus other lifters just don't.
Yeah, so the number one thing I'd say is like in the sense of like time to peak. I don't think that is some set time. Like if let's say you do a 5 week block length with a certain coach, you could go to 20 other coaches and every single coach is going to have it a little bit different, because it's mainly about how you're structuring the program and the rate of progression that you're wanting to do and get to a certain point. I would say, at least in how I find with my athletes, probably the biggest correlating factor to block length is the starting point to end point difference, and how big is that rate of progression from the initial starting point to the end point. Um, my athletes who make, in a sense, smaller weekly jumps, I tend to have longer block lengths for. The ones who make bigger jumps, which a lot of times correlates with higher absolute intensities and weight on the bar, I tend to have shorter block lengths with. And I think that's in large part because of the extremity of like how do I put this? because it's kind of backwards. You would think that if you need to ramp up more, you need more time, but I actually find it the opposite almost, because when you're you kind of go back to the Marcellus kind of method where you have Ashton and Bob hitting these absolute extreme loads, like they just can't do that very frequently. And the amount they have to pull back is pretty extreme to taper back off of that. Versus if I've got a 52 kilo female, she can handle decent weight on a consistent basis. Like she doesn't have to have that much of a pullback, and she can kind of maintain a certain intensity throughout 4, 5, 6 weeks without kind of having that tipping point where they kind of fall over and hit that like wall.
You know, I mean, it makes a lot of sense because if you touch those higher intensities, that can just be hard to recover from. As far as like jumps into that last week, would you find that like with a bit bigger and stronger lifters, they just benefit from like that bigger jump into like the week 3 to week 4, or have you found that like having like more like an even jump works best?
I tend to do more even jumps. I know Marcellus obviously does a little bit more disproportionate stuff. I definitely have a bit more even, and I don't think either is wrong. It's just how are you basing the stimulus that through those weeks 1, 2, and 3 to set up that week 4, and then how hard are you pushing that week 4? I don't think either is wrong, and it's just kind of dependent on the lifter. I have a couple. It might even be lift dependent. I can think of 1 or 2 people I have that we maybe make a bigger jump into like that final week for deadlift, because we know it's going to be a little bit more disproportionately fatiguing to push that a little bit earlier on. So maybe it's just my analytical and organized mind, but I just like evenness. It just kind of makes sense to me. So I tend to, I think, like I said, I think you can set it up any way you want and it's going to work. I don't think either is right or wrong. Is you can be able to set up the actual like workload and progression however you want, whether it's even or disproportionate, and you're probably going to get pretty similar results. It's just based on the system of how you want to set up that progression.
Yeah, and I think if the lifter is better able to like self-organize too based on like how they're actually feeling, you can kind of like come up with that more predictable like range based on like how they adapt. Because some people do make a bigger, they seemingly just feel better on the week 4s by like a lot compared to their week 3s, whether or not that's psychological or physiological. I don't really think it matters as long as it's working. Um, is there a point where you might say that, you know, it might make sense to like have like a 3-week block length? Because I know that like some lifters do that. But like Marcellus, but it's less common.
I wouldn't be a good person to ask, just I don't have anyone that does that. So therefore, I don't have a good idea of what I would say is like the archetype of a lifter I'd recommend that for. I believe Sean has a couple people that do that. And we talked about that, I think, on the Powerlifting Now podcast, but I'm blanking on kind of the reasoning he said for that. But I don't doubt in any way that it could be a reasonable thing. We even talked about on Powerlifting Now podcast of it was an idea for one of Matt Cronin's clients, I believe. Maybe it was one of Sean's clients, actually. Either or. That they really struggled to do longer block lengths with deadlifts, but squat and bench needed it. And so they were running, we talked about like a 6-week block for squat and bench, but rotating 3-week wave loads within that with deadlift.
Hmm. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah. And I think that's probably a factor of just like fatigue sensitivity of like how often can you actually touch heavier weights. Because if you're running 4, 5, 6-week blocks, like the longer the block you're running, you're probably hitting more higher intensities frequently. Like you're probably not going to run a 6-week block where weeks 1 through 5 are like incredibly submaximal for RPE and then make a big jump. You're like I said, the people I have running 5-week blocks tend to be more my lighter weight lifters than my women, because they can handle these loads on a more frequent basis and they need it to drive progress. Versus a bigger guy and lifting 400 kilos for deadlift, like how often can they actually touch these loads? So I think it has to do a lot with the fatigue sensitivity of lifts. So yes, I think it's a very viable option if someone's really fatigue sensitive, or for a specific lift where maybe you need to actually have a different block length within another block with one specific lift like deadlift, where they might be really, really sensitive to it.
It makes a lot of sense when you said like the longer blocks you're going to just have to touch heavier weights more frequently. That's something I never really thought about. Was like in my mind, I've always been like, well, maybe you just keep the like lighter earlier on, but no, I think that it makes a lot of sense.
You may keep it lighter. You may keep it lighter, but I think there's going to be more times like even later in the block. Like maybe you keep it extra light weeks 1, 2, and 3, but still weeks 4 and 5, you're probably going to start ramping it up. Yeah,
right.
In some way, your average peak intensity throughout the block is probably going to be a little bit higher than someone running shorter blocks. I
Yeah,
think on
that
average.
makes a lot of sense. So I wanted to ask last topic about programming downsets. I think we kind of touched on this a little bit, when you're talking about the training max. But where are some scenarios in which you would use, different methods of back off sets, so like straight sets versus ascending sets versus like descending sets?
Yeah, I think a lot of this probably goes to lifter psychology, but it's just kind of looking at kind of how they are. So I assume we're kind of talking, if we're looking about down sets, back off sets, we're having a top set approach and then reducing from there. You got to kind of look at how does someone react after a top set. And there's kind of three ways. One, they do a top set and they go to their back off sets. And in general, they're pretty even keeled. Like they don't have this big adrenaline dump. There's not this big change. Like we don't see this disproportionate like ramp up and like exertion when it shouldn't be. Like we know these back off sets should be easy. Why are they 7 to 8 RPE? Straight sets work great. That's a simple method to be able to control average intensity. It's frankly for like I can't think of the right word for it. For convenience, it's a little bit better just to let people do 4 sets of 5 with the same weight versus telling them they have to change it 4 separate times. Like there's a convenience
Yeah,
aspect of like how you're programming. If you can, like straight sets work great. Like now you don't have to change the weight every single set. But we see some things with their certain lifters where one, maybe after a top set they have a big adrenaline dump or a fatigue drop. Like if you have someone who goes through their session pretty quick, in a good way, like they're not taking 10 minutes between sets and they're taking 2 to 3 minutes, they may come into their first back off set relatively a bit more like acutely fatigued from that top set. And then you notice every set after for back off sets get easier and easier. And it's because they're getting further and further away from that top set. So it makes sense in that method to do an ascending back off set method rather than making them do straight sets. Let's make that first set a little bit easier since we know it's going to be a bit disproportionately harder than we meant for it to be. And then ramp back up because we know as the sets go along, you're actually going to get better throughout that, whether it's the mental drop off or the actual acute fatigue from that top set. Or the opposite, maybe you have someone who does a really good job of like holding their exertion level and their intensity, but they're actually truly getting fatigued through the back off sets. Like they're actually starting to have a decrease in performance that's notable. And that's where you might use a descending set method of like, okay, we know that the first set you're probably going to perform pretty well at, but whenever we do the straight sets, we notice that like it disproportionately ramps up by that last set. And like, I didn't mean for it to be that difficult. Let's do some descending sets and actually let that like intensity start dropping off so that we can keep this relative RPE or exertion or whatever we want to be doing within this range that we're looking for. So a lot of that is like, I mean, probably most people, I'm starting off with straight sets and then seeing how they react to that and then
right.
seeing kind of how they go from there. And that's where I tell people, especially on the initial console call, how important it is to rate your last set RPE, because that's very important for you to know what's going on there, or rating your RPE for all 3 sets of your back off sets. Like that's very, very important, especially when I first coach someone, because that's how I'm going to start individualizing your back off set model and approach based on how I see the actual execution and exertion from one, an actual like execution standpoint, and 2, from a mental standpoint, because we all know there's some people like they send us their back off sets and they rate it 7 RPE and we look at it, we're like, dude, that was like 3 RPE. That was not hard.
Yeah.
Like you're just not mentally focused, so you're calling it a 7. So that's important as well to get the video feedback there, and again be able to take that and then start to tailor and customize how you're actually doing those downset approaches.
Yeah, I like how you said, it's basically just off of that fatigue response. I've also noticed that for myself, like, this isn't like, I'm like on secondary days, like I do ascending sets for that exact same reason. Because like I'm kind of just like psychologically, like I'm like I don't want to be here. But then if I do ascending set, it's like cool, like I feel more focused, and I notice that my last set performance is always better because I warm up a little bit more for that, and it's light enough. And then on like it also changes between lifts on how the overall fatigue response is. I think probably straight sets are more common for bench, less common for deadlift, squat somewhere in the middle, and then you kind of just need to gauge things off of that. In regards to, we mentioned, the whole training max using like percentages, but like what are some ways or that you would like determine like that percentage back off of like a top set? Because I believe that this is becoming a little bit less common as like weeks progress, because like for myself, I use like the percentage back off. It's like for the first week, and then I tell my lifters to add like 5 to 15 pounds depending on like the lift week to week.
Yeah. So the percent back off, like it's going to be hard to explain the entire model. If you watch, did you watch the whole back off
Yeah,
series I had on powerlifting up? So
yeah,
I base everything like I look at everything from a lens of exertion, and that kind of helps to keep things systematic. And so, like, if I have an 8 RPE top set and I want the back offsets to be in general around 5 RPE, if 1 RPE equals about 3%, that means I'm going to back off around 9%. And I might factor other things into it. I might factor in it's deadlift, and this person specifically with deadlift just gets a little bit more tanked from a top set. So now I'm going to add some additional back off percentage to account for that. Whatever it may be. It may be that fact that I know they get a little bit more taxed through multiple back off sets, so I need to change the back off percentage based off of that. So yeah, I definitely look at like in range of exertion. And so like I'm looking at 3%, like a 3% model of like, okay, what is the top set and how much do I want to back off from there? And within that, how your top set progression is might dictate that too. Because like if you're making big weekly jumps, you don't want that percent back down to maybe necessarily jump with those top sets. That's one where you could use percentages, or you can actually taper, or like, yeah, taper the amount you're backing off. Maybe I'm only backing off 6% week 1, and then week 2 I'm backing off 8%, and then 10%, and then 12% by week 4, because I don't want those back offsets to ramp in the same intensity as the top sets are ramping up. And so I can be able to tailor that as well based on the fact of like, okay, maybe week 1 is an RPE 6 top set, and I want to drop around to like 4-ish RPE, so it's only 6% back down. But then week 2 is a 7 RPE top set, but I still want to be around like 4 to 5 RPE. I don't want to really raise that average intensity too much. So now they need to back off by 9%, if that makes sense. So you can actually taper that too. And I think that's very important to do, because I think a lot of people don't realize if you just use the same back off percentage every week and you're having this lifter make big weekly jumps, that is a very different microcycle week to week in what's actually being programmed.
Right. And that can be a big reason why people feel really good. They're making these really good adaptations early on in the block, because the average intensity is around a certain spot. Then it bumps up so much later on in the block. It's like they tank because of that. I've seen that a lot.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's why I think that I don't know how many people use that model, but I think it's incredibly important to use some model for back offsets, but I really like the way I do it because it just makes sense to me. And I think it makes sense to probably people who watch the video. It's just using that 3% method to be able to kind of tailor that so that you can have the ability to individualize it for a multitude of reasons and be able to, like, on paper say, I know exactly what I want the back offsets to be by using this certain percentage drop versus just pinning a 10% and that's it. Like, I don't know how many times I see someone do like a top set of 3 and then back offs for 6 and they just do 10%. And I'm like, you realize that's literally the same thing.
Yeah,
on
same
paper.
thing.
You're not doing a top set and back offs. You're doing all, like, I don't think you realize that you're not accounting for factors here. So I think it's really important to have some type of model, whether it's the one I use or someone else's own, whatever you want to do, some type of model of like, why are you actually backing off a certain percentage? And then also having an idea of like, what do you actually want these back offsets to do and be like for me, I mentioned in those videos for bench, probably around like 4 to 7 RPE. I don't really tend to want the back offsets to be much harder than that. If I want higher intensity, I'm just probably going to do ascending sets and more like a double top set or something. The back offsets I want to be within that general vicinity. For squat, maybe 4 to 7 RPE as well, maybe even a little bit lower. And then for deadlift, probably more of like unrateable up to 6 RPE. And so because of that, since I have this idea, it doesn't mean those are the right numbers. That I'm not saying that's how everyone should do it, but because I have this idea of what I want it to be, and then I apply that model to it, it tends to play out how I want it to more often, because there's an actual system for why I'm backing off certain percentages to get to a certain exertion level.
I think this is also why it's important to have like a general philosophy of how you program like each lift and how you troubleshoot each lift. And every lift behaves a little bit differently for every single person, but there are also these general guidelines to follow with how much volume do you need to do for a certain lift, what should the average intensity actually be, because that does dictate a lot of why you might make some programming choices.
Yeah, and it can be different between coaches. There isn't a right and wrong if it works for you, but having actual like systems and like models of like why you're doing certain things for each lift, even if you're wrong for you're right for the wrong reasons. I'll use that word. Like I was like, what I mean by that is like Louis Simmons. A lot of the things he did was right for the wrong reasons. Like he was doing things that worked really well, but the reason why he thought it was working maybe wasn't the reason it was actually working. I probably have some of that. I'm probably like sold on some of the things I do that I think is working for this reason, and it is working, but I might be wrong on the reason it's working, but it doesn't matter because I at least have this thought of like why I'm doing it, if that makes sense.
Right. Right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Steve. Always a pleasure to pick your brain. I think that you have
Yes.
some of the most well organized thoughts in powerlifting.
Well, thank you.
Of
The big
course,
question, this is my third time. Who has me beat? Who do I need to beat? What's the record for appearances?
I think you're the first person I've asked on 3 times, because I've asked Matt and Marcellus on twice. I've asked Eric Helms on twice. Those are my repeat guests.
Okay, this is my accomplishment of the year, being the
So
first
you're my
3-time
favorite.
guest on the Adam Peeler podcast. Yeah, perfect.
You're my
Appreciate it, man.
favorite.
I love coming on here because you always have good discussion and ask good questions. And I get to just talk about coaching and rant about it. So I love it.
I always get in my head because I'm like, am I going to ask good stuff, or is you going to look at me like I'm stupid?
Oh no.
But
See, well, a bit. I'm gonna. This is. I think maybe this is biased. I don't know. Whatever. I host a podcast as well. When I have other people on Two White Lights that also host podcasts, if I'm kind of throwing this to you, you can tell a difference because like I kind of know what I need, like how to be able to kind of like lead things on and like
yeah,
what you're trying to get. I know exactly what you're trying to get to probably before you even say it, because I know because of hosting podcasts, like the rhythm and like how things kind of flow and everything. And it makes it a lot easier. Like whenever on Two White Lights, we have someone who's hosts podcasts come on, it makes it so much easier because it's just the experience of understanding the flow of things.
right.
And you really can't have
Well,
bad conversations when that happens. So
not unless you try. But
yeah.
cool, man. I'll link all of your links in the description below.
Yep.
And thank you guys for listening to the podcast. Talk to you guys in the next episode.